She walked into the hangar like any other cadet, slender, quiet, too polished. The others smirked. They'd heard the rumors. Diversity pick. Quota filler. No one expected her to last a week. But when the colonel mentioned a mission gone wrong in Kandahar, she flinched. Not because she'd heard of it, because she'd been there, flying with the Night Stalkers. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit the subscribe button. They had been arriving all morning, fresh-faced cadets stepping off transport buses, some still laughing from the ride, others already scanning the airfield with tense excitement. Among the dozens of olive and khaki uniforms moving under the shadow of the flight school's concrete towers, one figure moved quietly. She wore the same issued fatigues, same boots, same name tag stitched across the chest. But something about her presence was different, not louder, quieter. She didn't talk, didn't linger, didn't flash a smile. She simply walked through the gate, duffel bag in hand, and headed to the check-in line without meeting a single eye. Her name was Ava Stratton. She had signed in like the rest of them, but while others cracked jokes or snapped photos in front of the hangars, she had stood alone, barely shifting her weight as the instructors barked out dorm assignments. One of the sergeants glanced up at her form, paused briefly as if he recognized the name, then looked back down. A moment passed, nothing was said. The line moved forward. The airbase itself had seen generations pass through its gates. Tarmac worn smooth by 1,000 boots, sun-bleached signs marking hangars that hadn't been repainted since the Cold War. There was a strange rhythm to this place, an unspoken hierarchy that formed before the first orientation even started. The loudest cadets always rose first, carving out space in the dorms, the gyms, the mess hall. Those who kept quiet were labeled early, ghosts, floaters, stragglers, the ones no one remembered until test scores came back. Ava fit none of those molds, yet somehow she was placed at the bottom of them all. By day 2, the whispers had started. That's her. That's the diversity pick. One of the louder cadetses, a Boston-born aviation major named Carter Ree, had said it first, just loud enough at breakfast to be overheard. Every cycle's got one. They pad the stats. Another cadet had chuckled, and from there the word spread like oil across water. Ava didn't respond, not when they accidentally left her out of team drills, not when they groaned every time she was assigned to their flight sim rotations, not even when one of them drew a little pink heart on her training helmet. Instructors didn't interfere, not because they were cruel, but because nothing Ava did warranted attention. She hit all her marks, stayed within regulation, answered when called, her fitness scores were above average, her test results were flawless. But there was no spark, no aggression, no fire, at least none that they could see, and that made them more uncomfortable than if she had fought back. What no one knew was that Ava had lived entire lives before setting foot on that base. Her birth certificate said 35, though she looked barely 28. Her hands told another story entirely, steady, scarred, and trained to move by instinct, not hesitation. She had filed the paperwork 6 months earlier under a special civilian-to-officer transfer clause, one that raised eyebrows but wasn't illegal. It had taken one phone call from a name they weren't allowed to type into unsecured systems, one quiet referral. No one looked too closely after that. Her quarters were the smallest in the dorm wing, single bunk, metal locker, one barred window facing the maintenance depot. At night, she would lie in silence listening to the dull roar of turbine testing in the distance, the faint metal-on-metal rhythm of maintenance tools tapping through the dark. While the others scrolled through their phones or laughed over blurry group selfies, she would trace calloused fingers along the edge of a folded map, hidden behind her locker panel. Southern Afghanistan, Kandahar, Helmand Province. Some of the creases had sweat stains baked into them. One corner was missing entirely, burned off long ago by something hotter than the sun. By week 3, her silence had become a target. "Hey, Stratton," one cadet called out on the runway during pre-flight drills. "You gonna actually speak today or just absorb?" Ghosting between parked Humvees and cargo crates, Ava walked back to her quarters without speaking to anyone. Carter Ree tried to match her stride, but fell back when she didn't respond. The dormitory hallway was unusually quiet. That night, everyone had seen it. Now her stillness during the clip, her clenched jaw, the way she hadn't blinked when the gunfire started. Nobody said the words, but something had shifted. They no longer thought she was unqualified. Now they thought she was dangerous. 3 days later, the assignments changed. Quietly, her name appeared in bold on the advanced rotary wing list, a track no one had seen her request. Ree, ever the loud one, barked out, "Wait, Stratton? Seriously? Who the hell signs are off for night ops?" A few cadets nodded in agreement, but the instructors didn't answer. It was clear someone far above their pay grade had authorized it, and nobody wanted to be the one to question that kind of authority. Ava showed up to the first rotation briefing, already in gear. No protest, no reaction to the noise around her. She studied the terrain schematic like she already knew the route, and maybe she did. The flight sim was different now. Gone were the basic engine failures and stall recoveries. Now it was full-scale evasion. Blacked-out landscapes, hostile airspace with variable intel overlays. Ava never flinched. She moved through the threat zones with uncanny precision, predicted R routes before the AI flagged them, and executed low-altitude maneuvers so tight the instructor at the console leaned forward involuntarily as if trying to catch a mistake. She didn't make one. It was on week 10 that her pass began leaking through the cracks, not by her words, but by omission. Instructors stopped referring to her as cadet. They started using pilot. And when a civilian contractor came in for a guest lecture, retired night stalker, quiet man with burn scars up his arms, he spotted her in the back row and paused mid-sentence. His brow furrowed. Then he continued the lecture without addressing her, but his tone changed, less theoretical, more real. Everyone noticed. After class, he waited by the door as the cadets filed out. He caught her with a glance. "Didn't expect to see you in a classroom again." She didn't answer, just nodded. "They still call you Raven?" "No," she said. "They don't call me anything." The man gave a quiet, almost respectful laugh. "Well, that's going to change." It did. The colonel called her in the next morning. No salute, no introduction. He pointed to a closed file on his desk, thick, red-banded with a lock code not common to flight school. "You're not here to train," he said. "You're here to observe, or rather, to remember who you were." She remained standing. "That voice in the clip, he said it was you." Ava didn't deny it. "And you flew under Night Stalkers. That part I figured out weeks ago." Still no reply. So he continued. "Why the charade? Why come back through cadet ranks? You could have taught half the syllabus blindfolded." She looked at him then, for the first time, fully. "Because I forgot why I started flying." That silenced the colonel more than anything else. He nodded slowly. "There is an advanced live rotation next week," he said. "Real gear, real nighttime insertion training. Yes, but with Blackhawks, full comms, risk parameters. I want you in the bird. Observer, pilot, full control." Ava hesitated. "You'll catch heat for that." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "I already have. But the Army is not in the business of wasting pilots who've landed under fire 6 times in one night." She stared at the wall behind him for a moment. One of the framed mission photographs, black silhouettes against a burning skyline, then nodded once. Lieutenant Calder's boots crunched softly across the snow-packed tarmac as she moved toward the edge of the open hangar. The storm was easing for the first time in 12 hours, just enough to reveal the dented outlines of silent machinery buried under frost. Her breath clouded in the cold, but she didn't slow. Her fingers clenched inside her gloves, not from cold but from something older, something forged over years of being underestimated and dismissed, packaged into a file labeled capable but untested. She'd seen it on more desks than she could count. She no longer flinched. The maintenance crew barely looked up from the turbines of the idle Blackhawk as she passed, clipboard in hand. Not because she was invisible, but because they still... The Gray not as a substitute, not as backup, but as the only one who never stopped preparing for this moment, even when nobody else believed she'd ever take it. Snow hammered the cockpit windows like a fist from the sky. Visibility dropped to almost zero. The Blackhawk's instrument panel flickered, one of the external sensors iced over, and the terrain proximity warning screamed in the headset. But her hands didn't shake. Mira gripped the cyclic gently, as if it were an extension of her body. Her thumb nudged the trim, adjusting pitch against the roaring headwind. Outside, the rotors carved tunnels in the storm. The blizzard had swallowed the peaks whole. No one else spoke in the back. The med crew worked in muffled chaos, hands bloody, stabilizing a man with a crushed leg and another barely breathing from hypothermia. The noise of the stretcher straps echoed once, then silence, broken only by the Blackhawk's engine howling against the storm. Mira exhaled. Not fear, calculation. She'd flown this model before, but never like this, never unauthorized, never alone. The co-pilot was still unconscious from earlier turbulence, the captain gone. She didn't speak of him. Base had stopped responding 6 minutes ago. Either the storm severed comms or command still didn't know she'd taken off, but she had to make a call. Through a slit in the cloud she saw it. Ridgeline ahead. No time to climb. She banked hard left, rotor blades screaming, clipping wind shear like a sword through silk. The altitude alarm screeched again. Mira ignored it. Her eyes were locked on the topography, burned into her memory. She was flying, not just by sight, but by instinct. In the rear cabin, a young rescue tech clung to a rail and stared forward. His helmet wasn't fastened. His eyes widened. "She's not supposed to be flying," he whispered to no one. "She's just the flight data tech." Mira heard it. Headsets were still live. She didn't respond. She just feathered the collective, dropped the nose 3 degrees, and threaded a gap between two mountain teeth so narrow even experienced pilots would have hesitated. They made it through. The rescue tech stood frozen. Another crew member slowly turned toward him. "Wait, did you say Mira?" He nodded. The crewman squinted. "She flew with the Night Stalkers." "That's her. That's the one from the thing in Kunar?" "What?" "Shut up," someone muttered, but it was too late. The words were out. Suddenly, everyone in the cabin looked forward, not just at the woman flying, but at the ghost of a reputation they didn't know they were flying with. Mira tuned them out. The landing zone was 3 miles ahead, if it hadn't vanished under snow. The radios crackled again, barely audible. "Hawk 3, if that's you, there's no place left to land. Repeat, LZ is buried. Evac on hold." Mira clicked the mic twice. She didn't say a word. She pushed the collective. The chopper rose like a shadow from the snow, blades throwing white spirals across the sky, and she made her own landing zone with her bare mind. The desert winds cut sideways across the base, whirling the red grid into low vortexes that hissed against the metal siding of the forward operations hangar. In the briefing room overhead, projectors buzzed quietly above a tactical table littered with aerial maps, supply routes, and threat assessments. Most eyes were fixed on Major Strickland as he outlined the day's deployment schedule. But not all. 2 seats back from the table, a young cadet leaned toward another and whispered, "Guess who's flying Overwatch on Convoy Bravo?" The smirk that followed said everything. They all knew, or at least thought they did. The diversity pick. The woman who didn't belong. Not to them. Not to this unit. Certainly not to the Night Stalkers. Outside, a Chinook's twin rotors thundered in synchronized rhythm, a familiar backdrop to the tense murmurs that always preceded a high-risk mission. The Night Stalkers' 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment operated in the margins between silence and thunder. Most who wore their patch did so with years of sweat, blood, and uncompromising trial behind them. But not her, they whispered. She didn't crawl through the mud at Campbell, didn't get tapped by Legacy. She got here because someone needed a female name on the manifest. That was the story. No matter that none of them could fly like she did, they refused to believe that mattered. She sat alone that morning reviewing telemetry from the last night flight, her flight. Not a scratch on the readouts, not a variance on the nav data. She'd flown clean through a narrow valley in near zero visibility, hugging terrain with only 2 feet to spare between her rotor tips and canyon walls. She hadn't told anyone what really happened on that mission, that they'd taken fire, that her co-pilot froze, that she'd flown blind for 27 seconds after a sandblast cracked the forward canopy. Because if she had told them, it would have changed nothing. At 07, "We've got movement on the ridge. 8 o'clock. Possible insurgents." Instinct took over. She didn't flinch, just keyed the countermeasure systems and angled the bird to shield the wounded, then grabbed the rear throttle herself and swung the tail around to give her gunner line of sight. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, but she held her ground. 3 minutes later, they were airborne again. 6 souls aboard, 3 of them barely breathing, 2 unconscious, and 1 crew chief yelling to stabilize a bleeding femoral artery. In the base tower, Strickland stood frozen as the blip returned to radar. The voice on comms was calm, controlled, familiar. Night Stalker 1 returning, package secured. That night, no one whispered. They just stared, and one by one, they began to understand what her flight record could never show, that courage wasn't always loud, and mastery didn't need applause. The hangar lights buzzed overhead, fluorescent lines flickering faintly against the high concrete beams as the Black Hawk settled back onto the pad. Steam rising off its fuselage and ghostly trails where cold snow met hot metal. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft before the rotors had fully wound down, yellow vests darting in and out of the snowmelt, boots kicking up slush and gravel. The shrill of clipped comms ricocheting through the night like insects in a tin can. But inside the cockpit she didn't move. Her fingers rested lightly on the throttle, not gripping, not releasing, just there. Quiet, breathing. The floodlights lit her face from the side, streaks of blood on her flight suit that weren't hers, wind-burned cheeks glowing faintly from the high-speed drop through mountain air. Her braid had come loose during the final descent, a few golden strands frozen across her forehead. No one was looking at her, not yet. They were too busy pulling out the survivors, 2 on stretchers, 1 walking on shattered legs with his arms slung over the crew chief. One of them, the youngest, barely out of training, turned his head just before disappearing into the med tent and gave her a look she wouldn't forget. Not gratitude, recognition, the kind you only gave someone who'd held Beth off for another hour and never asked for applause. Major Strickland stood 30 paces from the pad, arms crossed, not saying a word. He didn't need to. Everyone else did it for him. The same officers who had whispered, the same cadets who had laughed. Some looked away now, others held their gaze a little too long. She passed them like she didn't see any of it, like she had nothing left to say, like the mission had been just another entry in the logbook, except it wasn't. She dropped her helmet onto the rack beside the hangar entrance and walked straight into the operations bay, still in full gear, snow melting in rivulets down her shoulders. The after-action review was already waiting for her, a blank screen and an empty chair. One by one the senior command entered, then someone else. The door clicked behind her. Captain Herrera, one of the Night Stalker originals, 32 missions, 3 wounds, still walked like the helicopter cockpit was an extension of his spine. He didn't sit, just stood with his arms folded, eyes narrowed. "You broke protocol," he said, "engaged on incomplete recon, diverted from a secondary insertion grid, made 3 maneuver deviations from the approved night route." She didn't answer. Herrera stepped closer. "And every single man you pulled out is still alive." Silence. He let that sit. Then, "I flew with Daniels in 2004. You know what he told me back then? He said you don't measure a pilot by their log hours, you measure them by what they do when the radios go dark and there's no one coming." He leaned in, voice low now. "You flew like you knew no one was coming and you made it back anyway." She looked at him, no pride, no challenge, just quiet resolve. He nodded once, then turned to leave. But halfway to the door, he paused. "There's something you should see." They weren't supposed to be there. Not at bad hour, not in formation, not without orders, but they were. 12 men and women from various divisions of the 160th, all in gear, lined up along the edge of the tarmac, where the snow had started falling again, in soft, defiant flakes. No one spoke, no one moved. They were waiting. And when she stepped out of the ops building, still stunned from Herrera's words, still wondering if any of it had actually happened, they did something that had never been done for her before. They stood to attention, silent, unblinking, not because of rank, not because of policy, but because something had shifted in the invisible that would fit in a field on an after-action form. There was time, and I took it. Word of the hearing reached the cadet dorms before she even cleared the corridor. That night, she found a note slipped under her door, folded maintenance paper, scratched with 2 sentences. They said, "Quota, we were wrong. Respect." No signature, just 7 cadet numbers written underneath. The door across the hall eased shut as she picked up the paper. Whoever left it didn't want thanks. She slid it inside her flight manual and lay awake until the generator kicked over at 23:07, blinking green through the blinds. 3 days later came the official invitation, a sealed envelope delivered by a civilian courier in a sedan with no plates. Inside, one line in government courier type, "Report to H35, 2200 hours, field uniform." She knew H35, the night vision dome at the far edge of the base, older than most satellites, rumored to be where the Night Stalker's child knew sensor suites. She walked there under a moon so bright it turned the snow into rippled glass, her footsteps crisp and solitary. Inside the dome waited Colonel Hayes, Captain Herrera, and a pilot she hadn't seen in 10 years. Jesse Prairie Dog Alden, still lank, slender grin tucked under a dusty mustache. He offered a gloved fist instead of a handshake. "They finally stopped hiding you," he said. What Hayes laid out wasn't a reprimand. It was a recruitment pitch disguised as contrition. The regiment had lost 4 senior aviators in 18 months. Rotation, burnout, family hardship, one fatal crash in a valley with no name. They needed instructors who could teach more than procedures, who could read the dark like Braille and guide green crews through invisible corridors, who could teach humility without speechifying about it. "You never lost that," Hayes said, sliding over a new patch, still warm from the embroidery gun, a Blackhawk over a silver crescent moon. Night Stalker flight standard, but the moon was inverted. Tips pointing up, like hands ready to lift. "It's an instructor variant," he explained. "Means you carry others." He waited for her answer. She didn't pick up the patch, not yet. She thought of the cadets who still avoided eye contact, of the handwritten note, of the kid whose frost-numbed fingers had clutched her flight suit like a lifeline when she hauled him aboard. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere that believed in her only after she broke their rules. Then she closed her hand over the badge and felt the threads bite her palm. "I'll teach," she said, her voice low, steady, "but on my terms." Hayes nodded. He'd expected nothing else. The first class assembled in Hangar 2, 1 week after the avalanche, 12 cadets, none older than 25, standing at parade rest in front of a stripped-down MH-60 with its panels labeled by chalk. She walked the line without a clipboard, calling no names. "You know the strobe code for a covert engine fire?" she asked the nearest cadet. He stammered, offering textbook numbers. She shook her head. "Wrong theater, wrong year. They changed it after fuel gel failures in Syria. Learn the new code or watch your crew die too slowly." She moved on. "Where do you stand when the tail rotor's downwash shifts a snow shelf overhead?" The next cadet opened her mouth. No sound came. "You don't stand," she answered. "You crawl, belly to ice. You breathe the snow and you pray the mountain lets you pass by." By the end of the hour, some cadets looked pale, others lit with something fiercer than pride. Respect laced with fear, the healthy kind that keeps arrogance from turning flight suits into coffins. She handed out no reprimands, no gold stars, just knowledge, heavy as ammunition. Flight plans lie, she told them. Terrain obeys no one. Trust only what your fingertips tell the stick. Days blurred into nights. She ate in the mess now, without whispers trailing her. Cadet still talked, but now in clusters around thumbed manuals, comparing her impromptu quizzes. Maintenance crews left fresh towels on her bunk, not because it was regulation, but because legends deserve courtesy. The baseband quietly updated the roster board outside operations. Beneath the list of instructor pilots, they stenciled a new line, CW4, Stratton A, Special Operations Guest Instructor. Someone taped over the typed guest after midnight. The next morning, it read only instructor. 3 weeks to the day after the rescue, the 14 survivors formed an honor line outside the gym. Some were still on crutches, one leaned on a cane, 2 bore new silver clasps, where bone had replaced steel. They waited until she finished morning PT and filed out into the sunlight, sweat freezing on her collar. The youngest stepped forward, holding a flight patch he'd had copied from a blurry photo. Crescent moon, diving hawk. Under it, stitched crookedly, 4 words, saved by the diversity pick. He grinned, eyes shining, more amusement than apology.